Hi, this is Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 38 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. This week, I want to quiet my Amiga 2000 down by quite a few decibels. See, right now she has a 20-year-old SCSI drive in it, a nice 7200 RPM, 4 gig SCSI drive, but it's loud and it's whiny, as you can very possibly hear in the background. Now, a lot of SCSI drives back in the day tended to be louder than their counterparts, but it didn't matter much because they were often used in servers, and so they were locked away in server rooms, so it didn't make much of a difference. This is not so good in a small office like mine, where I'm trying to record a video and the mic picks up every single sound that's out there. As you can hear through this unfiltered audio, it's quite noisy. Louder version of it right there. And even though it's a few feet away from me, it's very distracting. Now, if I did just, come around and put the cover on my Amiga 2000, that would probably help too. But I spent so much time going in and out of the machine with boards and cards and experimenting that it's almost worthless to put the cover on that thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace it with the SCuzzy2SD card made from Michael McMaster from Codesrc. This is what these little guys look like. Put the SD card right in there. It gets its power from that little connector, and you've got a standard 50-pin SCSI connector right there. Now, SCSI was used a lot in some of the nicer machines back in the 80s, like the Amigas and like the Macintoshes. IDE had not made its big splash yet, and the MFM drives from the old XT machines were like giant big things, and they tended to even be louder and lower capacity than the SCSI drives. And SCSI had the advantage of being able to chain 7 devices right onto it, like CD-ROM drives, like scanners, and such. So it was very versatile to use SCSI in a machine like this. But SCSI ultimately lost out to IDE, and IDE ultimately lost out to SATA, which is our recent standard that we use. So it's getting harder and harder to find actual SCSI drives, and when you do, they tend to be fairly expensive. So this little guy solves all our problems by emulating a SCSI drive using a standard SD card, a full-size SD card. Now these are tested and rated to use up to 128 gigabyte cards. With the Amiga, I recommended keeping them small enough so the Amiga can see them just fine. If you're still using Amiga OS 1.3 through 3.1, just make it easy on yourself and get a card that's smaller than 4 gigabytes and you won't have any issues. If you're using Amiga OS 3.1.4, 3.5, 3.9, you can get a much larger card and they'll work just fine because the Amiga will see cards that size. Now I'm using a 64 gigabyte card in my SCSI to SD because I'm using Amiga OS 3.1.4. It sees it just fine, sees the whole capacity. But as a rule of thumb, I use smaller than a 4 gig boot partition. So my workbench goes on anything smaller than 4 gigs. That way, if I have a problem, if I have an issue, I need to hook up the Amiga to another machine to troubleshoot workbench, any Amiga will see a partition 4 gigs or smaller. Just makes life easier. But your data partitions, your work partitions, go ahead and make them as big as you want to. Now the version of the card that I'm using is a version 5.1. They have a couple of different versions available. This one is fine for most machines like the Amiga 2000, Amiga 3000, and many controllers in the Amiga 4000. It can handle speeds up to about 2.5 megabytes per second. If the wind is blowing from the east and Venus is rising over Jupiter, you'll get those speeds. In reality, you'll see between 1 and 1.5 megabytes per second as a rule of thumb. Now there is a version that supports up to 10 megabytes per second, version 6, and the new firmwares they have out for that have stabilized it. There were issues at first, they work okay now. I recommend getting a version 6 if you have something like I have in my Amiga 4000, like a warp engine, where the SCSI can actually go up to 6 to 10 megabytes per second. The GVP card that I have in my Amiga 2000, the fastest I could get out of that with an actual SCSI drive is 1.7 megabytes per second. So the 5.1 card will do fine. Why spend the extra money? Same thing with the Amiga 3000. You get 2.5 megabytes per second. Why spend the extra money when the 5.1 card will work just fine? Now let's take a look at the PC side of things, because you have to set the SCSI to SD card up on your PC. So let's hook up the PC and we're going to take a peek. To configure this clever device, you need a good quality micro USB cable. And it's going to hook up right there. So it just plugs right into there, just like that. You're going to want to use a good quality cable, because a lot of cables that come with your cell phones really only charge the thing and they really don't transfer data. So you may go through 1 or 2 cables thinking they're perfectly good because they work with your phone. They don't transfer any data, they don't work. Just get a good cable. You can get the software for the SCSI to SD off of this website. It's Codesrc.com, and I'll put the link right down there so you can see it. And from here you can download the actual application, which right here, here's the Windows version. They also have a Mac and a Linux version, and just download the application from there. It's just an executable file. It doesn't install a bunch of stuff in the registry on your computer, so it's real easy to use. Once you download that, you're going to have an icon that'll say SCSI to SD utility. All right, plug in your device. It does not need power to the little Molex connector when you plug it in USB. Do not plug in the power when you plug it in via USB, because it will get all of its power from the USB cable. Very important. Launch the application, and if you want to see how your device is already configured, we're going to have to configure it, but what you do is you do File, Load from Device, and it's going to read from your actual SCSI to SD and basically just bring in the default settings. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is upgrade the firmware on it if you're not at the very latest. So back at our website, when we look at our downloads, we can go to firmware, and we see the latest firmware as of the date of this video is 4.8.03. Go ahead and download that to your computer. Any place is just fine. And then you can click File, Upgrade Firmware, locate the firmware that you just downloaded, click Open, and it's going to go ahead and flash the firmware on your device. Takes about 10-15 seconds. Now when you reload this little guy, load from device, you're going to see it'll come up now and it'll say that the device is using the latest firmware. The next step is to create an actual SCSI partition on your SCSI, your new SCSI to SD device. So you of course have your SD card already plugged in there. We go over here on our first page. We'll make a couple of changes here. Now SCSI termination, SCSI devices have to be terminated at the end of the chain. Sometimes it's a physical device that plugs in to the end of the SCSI cable and that terminates it. Sometimes, like the case with the CD-ROM that I use in my Amiga 2000, it has a little jumper, a termination jumper. If you don't have any of those, and all you're using is your SCSI to SD device, you're going to want to enable SCSI termination, and that's going to tell it, okay, this is the last device in the chain. So it all depends on whether or not you already have terminated devices on your unit. SCSI host speed, keep that at normal. It only needs to be slow for some really old machines. Startup delay, if your computer takes a while to get chugging along and you need to set a delay before it tries to pull the SCSI chain, you can set a 5 or a 10-second delay. Some older devices require that. Enable parity, that's a good one to enable right there. Enable unit attention, that is for hot swappable SCSI devices. I don't think you're going to be using that. Enable SCSI 2 mode. Now, my GVP card is a SCSI 2 device. So I enable SCSI 2 mode and it gives me maybe 30 to 50% faster performance. Your mileage may vary depending on your SCSI controller. If you're using it on an Amiga 3000, enable SCSI 2 mode, you'll get better performance. Disable glitch filter, that is kind of an error checking thing that the card does. If you're using, a rule of thumb is if you're using a short cable, enable the glitch filter or disable the glitch filter, you'll get a little better performance. If you're using a really long cable, keep the glitch filter enabled. You'll lose a little bit of performance, but you'll gain a little bit in reliability. Disk cache, just what it sounds, it caches some of the disk information. He says it's experimental. I keep it enabled, it works fine. Enable SCSI disconnect, respond to short SCSI selection pulses. Those are, again, with devices that you disconnect and reconnect. You're going to keep yours connected all the time. Now, onto the actual partitioning of the drives. You'll notice we've got device 1, device 2, device 3, and device 4 here. This lets you partition an SD card into 4 virtual drives. It will actually see it as 4 different devices when we go into HD Toolbox in a little while. This is really useful on some older SCSI controllers like the 2090A, which can only handle a 1 GB partition without changing the BIOS out. You'd take a 4 GB card, you'd split into 4 1 GB partitions right here, and it will see it as 4 separate devices. But you get to use the entire capacity of the card, just 1 GB at a time on a device like that. You would just enable SCSI target, and that enables the different devices. Now in my case, I'm using a 64 gig card, so I have device 1, enable SCSI target, device type hard drive, that's what we're going to want. Quirk mode, Apple of course is quirky. SD start sector and sector count, it will determine that automatically when you tell it what size it is. Now in this case, I'm giving it a device size of 28 gigs. I'm going to split it into approximately 2 28 gig partitions. Now it's a 64 gig card. Why am I saying 28 gigs instead of 32 gigs? It's because the people who manufacture hard drives and SD cards are all big fat liars. If you look in Windows or on your Mac at your 120 gigabyte hard drive, SSD drive, it'll say, hey, I'm 109 gigabytes. Well, where's my other memory? It's how they define and call a kilobyte and a megabyte, and they use these funny little formulas to trick you. So on a 64 gig card, you're really only going to see about 59 gigabytes of space. Do yourself a favor, make your card size smaller than what the card says, and you will be a happy camper. Because if you put a 4 gig card in here and you put 4 gigs down there in that device size, it ain't going to work and you're going to be really confused. You put 3.6 gig or 3.7 gig, hey, everyone's happy. So just do it. Make it easy on yourself. Now, I give mine a name. I'm just keeping Codesrc as the vendor, but I gave my product ID a different name, and you'll see why when we boot into the Amiga OS. I called this one Part 1, and device 2, it's a little bigger, 29 gigs, I called it Part 2. Now, generally, you're going to put a little check mark next to here where it says Auto, because that's going to be able to figure out where the last partition stopped and the new partition starts. Now, mine's not checked because I've already partitioned this, but in general, set the auto button and it will set your sector sizes and it will set your start sectors and everything automatically. Now notice here, SCSI ID 2, SCSI ID 1, you can change this to different IDs. In my case, I have my hard drive, my old hard drive is SCSI ID 0, so I can have all of these in a little chain together. Device 0, device 1, device 2, it sees everything. So save these settings now. We just do File, Save to Device. It writes it to the flash memory of the device. It's important to know it does not save the configuration to the SD card. It saves it to the actual device itself, and that will be important in a little while. Now let's switch back to the Amiga. Now you can see here on the Amiga, I have my SCSI to SD in this nice little 3D printed case already mounted in the computer. I have my old hard drive right here. They're both going to be connected together with my SCSI cables. So I just hook up my SCSI to SD into the chain. Powered up with a standard Molex connector, like this here. Now when I power on the Amiga, it should boot right up. And it should be booting to my old SCSI drive, because this one, in theory, is going to be blank. So in this case, I was going to be moving my old SCSI hard drive over to my new SCSI to SD. Now, full disclosure, I'd already done this and I've been working with it for a while. But when I plugged in my old SCSI hard drive, guess what died right before this transition? My old SCSI hard drive. So I'm glad I did it when I did it. So we're going to simulate what we're going to be doing. So you're going to boot up from your old hard drive like you normally would. Get back into Amiga OS just like we have right here. I'd already mentioned my rule of thumb is to keep your boot partitions under 4 gigs, so I'm going to do that right now. Let's go into HD Toolbox. You're going to notice that you're going to have your new hard drive showing up here. When you first set this up, the very first time you set it up, it's very probable they're going to say undefined. So what you're going to do, you're going to select the undefined drive. You're going to go into change drive type, tell it SCSI, and tell it define new, and tell it read configuration. And it's going to go ahead and read in the information from your SCSI to SD and set up the drives. Once you do that, it'll come up here that'll say status changed, save changes to drive. It's going to ask you to reboot your Amiga. Again, I've already done that step, so I'm not going to be rebooting my Amiga. But you do have to define the new drive and tell it to read the configuration. When it comes back up and you go back into HD Toolbox, go to your new partition, partition drive, and set up the partitions just like I've shown you in previous videos any way you want to. In this case, I have a 900 meg partition. Let's create up to a 3.9 gig partition here. Okay, so you see I've changed that to 3.9 gigs. I'm going to go to Advanced Options. I'm going to make it bootable, and I'm going to give it a new drive letter name. Let's say your old drive letter was SDH0. We have to create a new one for this new device. We're going to call this NB0 for new boot 0, just for testing purposes. So we make sure it says bootable. We go to change our drive type. Now, with Amiga OS 3.1.4, which I hope all of you are using right now, it's better to use larger block sizes, larger than the default 512. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and bump this up to 4096. It handles memory better when you do that. It performs a little bit faster when you do that. We're going to click OK. And we're going to, we don't need to change the file system. Click OK again. It'll say the drive is changed. Save changes to drive. Yes. So now we've just created our boot partition on the new drive. You can go in and now create your data partitions. In this case, I've got a 11 gigabyte SDH3 drive. I have a 15 gigabyte SDH4 drive that I've previously created. So those drives will be ready to go when I reboot. Asks us to reboot, no problem at all. When you get back into Workbench, you're going to notice your new drive letter says not initialized. That makes sense. We're going to click it to select it, go to Icons, Format Disk. Now, you're going to want to give this a different name than your original Workbench boot disk. You can change it later, but for the time being, it makes it easier and less confusing if you give it a different name. So we're going to call this one WB New instead of WB 2000 that my Workbench partition is called. Now, if you do name it the same thing, you'll probably be okay, but then if you try to copy things using that drive name, it's going to get all confused. And we're going to do a quick format. Format the 4 gigs, and it's done. The next step is getting the operating system from the old hard drive over to the new partition. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Open up a shell. Now we're going to copy sys. Sys is an assign. Sys : is an assign that represents your boot drive on your Amiga. So when I tell it to copy from sys, it's saying, okay, go directly to the boot drive. And we're going to do wildcard, which you'll know what that is if you watched my previous tutorial video. That's the symbol for the wildcard, £? Now we're going to tell it where to copy it to. In this case, to make life easy, we're going to copy it directly to the literal name of the drive, which is NB0. I could very easily have called that, copy sys £? To WB new. That works fine too, but this way we know we're going to the right drive. Then we're going to do clone all. What that does, it means make a copy of everything with the all command and clone all of the permissions using the clone command. When we hit enter, it starts copying. It's going to take a couple of minutes depending how big your Workbench partition is, but it's copying everything from your old hard drive over to your new SCSI to SD. So everything's going to remain intact. Now, you're going to do that same thing to all of your partitions. So if you have a work partition on your old physical SCSI drive, and you've created a new bigger partition on your SCSI to SD, you're going to do the same thing. Copy work : £? if it was called your work drive. If not, you can use the literal name of it. And then the name of your new work drive, clone all. Boom, copies everything over. It's a dream backing up and copying files on the Amiga compared to Windows. So after making sure that you've set your device to being bootable, which is a critical thing, once you reboot the Amiga, it should boot to the new SCSI to SD card, assuming you've taken the old hard drive out. Mine booted up just fine to it, boots up nice and fast, and I think you can hear it's substantially quieter. Let's take another listen. Now all you can hear is the whiny CPU fan on my 40 megahertz, or I'm sorry, my 33 megahertz 040 chip in here. I'll address that another time. But it is substantially quieter than it was before. Now, one of the other big advantages of this, you can turn the computer off, take that SD card out, and go hook it up to your PC. Use it with WinUAE. So you plug it into USB on your computer, one of the USB SD readers, or right into your SD reader on your computer. When you boot WinUAE, you can go in and tell it to view that SD drive as a hard drive. It can boot to it. It can see it as a device, so you can easily copy things over. You download them to your PC, copy them over to your SD drive through WinUAE. I hope that all makes sense. It's a lot of acronyms. I also use it with my card reader on my Amiga 4000. I can pop out my SD card from my Amiga 2000, pop it in to my card reader, attached to my Rapid Road USB. Watch my review on that. That's episode 4. And it will see the hard drive just fine. And I can copy things between my Amiga 4000 and my Amiga 2000 right over the SD card. It's a dream. Now, before you get any wild ideas about having 5 or 6 different SD cards with different operating systems, different ways of having it configured, and just plugging them in and running away, the configuration for the SD card is stored on the SCSI to SD device itself, not on the SD card. So if you go and plug another SD card in, you have to go through the procedure of programming the SCSI to SD on your Windows or your Mac machine, telling it how big it is, and then it'll work. You can load an operating system on it, whatever you want to do. But you can't just put in a 16 gig card now and a 32 gig card later and a 64 gig card and magically work, because it doesn't. Now, in theory, you can sort of do it if you buy 3 or 4 64 gig cards, partition them exactly the same number of sectors, same size, everything exactly the same, then in theory you should be able to swap them out with different operating systems. But it's not just a piece of cake. You have to really think about what you're doing. So is the SCSI to SD worth the money? Absolutely. I picked up mine for, I think it was $85, $90, including the 3D printed drive tray. You can get them directly from Inertial Computing. I'll put the link down here. You can generally get them from Amiga on the Lake if you want to buy it locally. They generally have them in stock. Most of the European companies also carry the SCSI to SD drives without any issues at all. So get one ordered. I recommend getting one with a 3D printed case, because when they're raw like this, they don't mount very well. They're kind of tricky to mount. I hope this guide has helped you out. I need to get a few more of these. I want to get a new 5.1 card for my Amiga 3000. I need to get a version 6 card for my Amiga 4000 because it'll handle the higher speeds. And then it will keep those machines nice and quiet like it's doing for my Amiga 2000. But until next time, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.